Thank you. Thank you to the Listen Network and Eve for allowing us to share our experiences with an equity auditing case. I think everyone knows on this call that CASE is the resource center for the Advancing Informal STEM Learning program at NSF, have been so since 2008. And we have a cooperative agreement with that program at NSF, and that allows us to serve both the awardees of that program, but also the wider field. And what we're going to be sharing with you today is results of a process we undertook, and we actually got the idea for originally back in November of 2019. We'll talk a little bit about that history, but I wanted to mention that, one of the benefits of having a cooperative agreement is that when new ideas occur to you as part of your work, you can raise those with the funder and iterate on how to incorporate them into a scope where they might not have already been. So with support from NSF, we conducted this equity audit. And so I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues and co-PIs. I think Cecilia Garibay first to kick us off. And I'm going to be running the slides today, so I'll be sharing my screen. Thank you again.
So as Jamie said, in this particular funding cycle, there were a number of threads of work that were being done, including some work in the broadening participation in STEM sort of area, so really equity focused. But that focus had been on the CASE team, convening individuals from the field and thinking a lot about the external part of our work, right? So really public facing, thinking about supporting communities in STEM, thinking about it from an equity perspective. And so there were a number of planned items of work within this particular funding cycle that the team had embarked on. One of them was a broadening participation toolkit, which included a report, a number of briefs meant for teams to come together and discuss some of their practices, and a number of other pieces. We also had an anti-racism resource roundup blog, and we're doing interviews that were highlighting Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, particularly in the STEM field. As we were working on the toolkit, one of the pieces of conversation that we had was very much thinking through, that is the external sort of public facing piece that we're focused on. But the other side of the coin is the internal piece. And what does it mean to do equity work if you're not also thinking about the ways in which decision making is happening, the way organizational culture is set up, all of these things that we talk about within our informal learning spaces that we felt also applied to a resource center. And so that was the conversation that was happening in the fall of 2019, and this sort of idea that was germinating just as we were disseminating the broadening participation toolkit really coalesced into a series of conversations about doing this particular equity audit. And so that really was the reason for doing it, was to really think about, after launching and disseminating that toolkit work, how we might then turn our attention to look internally and examine our own practices, activities, communications, really with a lens of how we were doing in terms of an equity space. We also anticipated that the equity audit would help to identify areas of strengths, gaps, and places that we could build on. The other piece that was specific in our equity audit is that we chose to intentionally focus on race. And part of the reason to look at racial equity was really in terms of the fact that, racial inequities really underline pretty much every domain in society. And historically, there was a lot of conversation within CASE around implications of power dynamics between researchers and practitioners. And so that felt, and like another layer, particularly in terms of where race might be playing an issue. And so that was both the germination and at that point, really the way in which we began to hone in a little bit on a focus. If you go to the next slide, just to give you a very particular definition of what an equity audit is, it's really essentially a systematic process where you're collecting, looking at a series of documents, analyzing. It can be lots of different things. It can even be conversations that you have. And really the idea is to support accountability. So it provides information and insights that then help you reflect very specifically on activities, and then give you a sense of accountability and ideally a plan moving forward. So if you go to the next slide, one of the things early on that we needed to think about is, well, how might we anchor our work? How might we give it some structure and framing? And so after a review of a number of several evidence-based frameworks and tools that were publicly available, some were free, some were fee-based, but we did a search. We decided to use the Equity in the Center's Awake to Woke to Work framework that would ground the audit. And essentially in that work and that framework, it suggests that organizations move through kind of a change cycle that shifts from white dominant culture to a race equity culture. And so they think of it as these 3 stages. Sometimes I often think of it in terms of moving from diversity to inclusion to equity work. You can think of the cycle in that way as well. And so the framework from Equity in the Center both maps out those stages and identifies 7 areas. You can think of them as levers that might help in an organization move forward on racial equity. And that's what you see around the outer part of the circle. So for example, leadership, the way that data are used, organizational culture, board of directors, and so forth. And so those are areas where they suggest, and the framework sets up a way for one to examine those areas and the work happening in those areas. And so that's what we used as a way of structuring some of our work in the equity audit. And we referenced this framework on a number of ways, both in really initially setting up the work and developing some rubrics and tools that we used in for ourselves in terms of interrogating our practices and analyzing pieces. What was also interesting, I'll mention, is that because we were a resource center, we also needed to do some ways of mapping out how this particular framework might apply to us. So for example, board of directors is not necessarily something that we have in the traditional way. So we began to map that out. And in our case, we thought of NSF as potentially serving that board of director function for our purposes. If we move to the next slide, this gives you a little bit of sense of how we mapped out the way that we might be thinking of the process. We thought that there was definitely going to be internal work that would be done by the team itself, and that meant the case team, and then that we would have some external input. And the idea was that this both sort of internal piece would inform certain pieces in terms of what we understood, in terms of shifts, practices, activities that we were doing, that the external piece would also give us a different lens, and that they would in some ways really cross-reference each other and help us to have just a more robust, holistic perspective on what we were finding throughout. So just to also say that Rabia, Mayas, and myself were the 2 co-PIs that co-led the equity audit work, but the whole case team was involved in the process. So throughout that, the case team, for example, set aside time in weekly meetings to check in on progress, share information. Sometimes we do reflective sessions. Team members were also involved in different aspects of the work. So we were really trying to, we were very intentional in finding a way to make sure that we were as available as possible as a team, noting that, of course, level of involvement depended greatly based on both availability, but also the other work that we were undertaking at case and who was leading that piece. So we'll talk a little bit about some of that in more detail. If we go to the next slide, what we ended up doing is then thinking about our work as maybe having 4, or we conceived it as having 4 separate strands, if you will. The first was that internal process that I already began talking about. And we use the equity in the center framework very specifically to help us begin to think about how we level set for each other and how we came together to think about this work. And so the goal of this thread was really to internally begin to look at our processes, practices, and systems. It involved a lot of conversation. One of the pieces early on, for example, that we did is the Equity in the Center framework has a whole report that has a number of terms at the back, almost like a glossary, things like white supremacy, dominant culture, and so forth. And we ran activities, for example, with the team where we moved through those particular definitions and created some activities and discussion around which of these terms, when did you first encounter these? What was that like for you? Which of these terms do you still struggle with? Which are maybe unclear? And it was a way really for us to both level set and to begin to build that dialogue among each other very early to be able to continue to do the work. The other piece, and part of also the reason that we chose the Equity in the Center framework, is that it had an internal assessment that was called a pulse check done in a beta form that allowed us to do that as a team. And Rabia will talk a little bit more about that, but just so you know that that's part of the thread. The other piece was an equity audit committee that we convened. So it was really an external committee of professionals that would help inform our approach and provide ongoing feedback and insights during the entire equity audit process. So it was composed of 8 individuals that were selected through a very specific set of criteria that we set up from a variety of sectors and who had diverse expertise in equity-oriented researchers, practitioners, et cetera, both in informal science education and SciComm, and that were and networked organizations. So we really invited this committee as members to help us be really critical thought partners and help us uncover, assess, and challenge and refine some of the ways that we were attending to equity, approaching even the equity audit. So for example, some of the areas that we talked about and assessed included things like DEI relevant language, power sharing, the inclusion of diverse perspectives in case decision-making. Those were some of the topic areas and some of the areas that we really focused on with the committee and invited input on. So our intention really was that the committee's expertise and perspectives were really brought to bear on the work of CASE, and in a sense also hold us accountable, particularly in terms of thinking it both broadly for the field, but also specifically, what did it mean to do this kind of work at a resource center, which in a sense is a question that I think we dealt with a lot that's very different when you're doing work for a single organization. So the other piece we did was we undertook a historical document review, and essentially we took a whole slew of different documents that CASE had a treasure trove of over its 15-year history, and looked at those with an equity-focused lens. So for example, some of the questions that we were really asking for the historical document piece was what evidence there was in that documentation of the extent and ways that CASE had focused on equity broadly and more specifically racial equity. We really asked ourselves the extent and ways, if at all, in which CASE had been a leader in advocating for advancing and centering equity and racial equity specifically. Had it, for example, taken a leadership role or a more supportive role, and then what opportunities there were for future work. And the last thread was doing some work in the awardee meeting. And this was actually a really interesting piece that surfaced that might be very specific to our process, in that CASE runs the awardee meeting for the AZLE portfolio every couple of years, and it's a huge part of our work. And so it just felt like it would have been a missed opportunity to not think about our equity work while we were also planning for and then running that meeting. And so as the equity audit work was being launched and we began planning efforts for the 2021 AZLE meeting, it just seemed like that gave us a unique opportunity to prioritize equity. And so we did a lot of ongoing reflection and self-assessment of that process, and in fact built a lot of tools that we used for a number of areas of the equity audit, including the awardee meeting. So I'm going to turn it over to Rabia to give us a little bit more detail on some of those.
Thanks, Cecilia. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things that we wanted to talk about was to just highlight how iterative the process was that Cecilia just laid out. It was a combination of the committee and the team, as well as our external evaluation firm and an external consultant. So if you look on the left side, those blue spheres or ovals really identify the people who were involved, and that's the same on the right. And what we wanted to show here was just all of the different processes, as Cecilia just outlined. The internal process in orange were things like our weekly equity check-in. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Meetings of the committee, the historical review, and the pulse check, which came with the Equity in the Center framework. And then really in green, showing quite a few of the steps that came through the planning and implementation of the awardee meeting. One of the themes that we kind of noted and will call out in our discussion is how so much of the work of the audit was around doing a deep assessment of case, and at the same time building practice in real time to operationalize some of the questions and learnings that we had. So in the planning of the awardee meeting, which led to things like the design of the meeting, rubrics to observe sessions. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides. But wanted to really just highlight here how integrated the process of conducting the equity audit and all of the players in the audit had in some of the regular processes of case along the way, as well as the deep assessment that we were doing over an extended period of time. So what we wanted to show you all, I think, for our remaining time together before we jump into questions, if we go to the next slide, are just some examples of some of the tools that we developed in the process. So Cecilia shared really beautifully the overarching framework, what grounded this work, and our efforts to really focus on those 4 areas. And if we go back one slide, Jamie, one of the things that we developed somewhat early in the process, as we were building the awardee meeting, but also recognizing the need to attend to equity in a much more regular and frequent way, was an equity checklist. Every time I say equity checklist, I get a little bit of an itch, because as we know, anyone who is thinking about or doing equity related work, there is a natural and I think appropriate aversion to things that might check a box. And this is not that. This was really a tool that allowed us to operationalize the asking of questions that would just give us a moment to pause and be thoughtful about where equity issues might be showing up in our practice, and how we might take a moment to, at a minimum, ask the question, but even move through, in an ideal scenario, what might be a way to address a particular issue or a challenge, or come to some solution. And so this series of questions, of which there are 7, we developed both in the planning of the awardee meeting, but used more broadly. And so they are relatively straightforward. So asking who or what is being centered in a particular process or decision. Are we defaulting to what we've typically done? Are we defaulting to who we know, right? That was particularly important when we think about inviting individuals or organizations to participate in the awardee meeting, right? Recognizing that expertise lies in a variety of domains, but if we're only thinking about the people that we know, we are often very limiting in the perspective and the pool of talent that we might be drawing from an equity perspective. Our questions also included things about language, and also, and to Cecilia's point earlier about the 2 of us co-leading this work, we wanted to be really honest and transparent about asking whether we were, and to what extent might we have been, overburdening people who identify as BIPOC, whether that's staff, co-PIs, participants at the awardee meeting, to do heavy lifting, right, related to equity. And then also thinking about things like, do sessions in the awardee meeting explicitly address or relate to a topic. So I wanted to go in the next slide to highlight that we had this checklist, but we also had some, that's going to be very hard to see if you don't blow up your screen. I'm going to read it for you. For each of those 7 questions, and again, we really started this checklist when we were planning the awardee meeting and then used it in some different ways, is that we came with some language that we wanted to help hold ourselves accountable. So for example, question 2, are we defaulting to what we've typically done? We wanted to have a little bit more meat behind that to help justify why that question was important, but also acknowledge what taking an equity focus and perspective really might mean. So we articulated that it's common when timelines are tight and or when we are stressed to default to doing things in the way that they've been done in the past. And that an equity focus requires different strategies, formats, approaches to ensure that we're making decisions intentionally and not simply because it's what we know and what we're comfortable with. Right, so really simple language that gave us the moment to really pause. And there were times, to be quite frank, when we were planning the awardee meeting or conducting other case business, where we checked in on ourselves and said, okay, you know what, are we just defaulting to what we did before? And how do we push beyond that to ensure that we are really attending to equity? What's been nice about this checklist is that, and Shannon really was leading this, is that this became a focus of our weekly co-PI meetings. So we have a checklist that is at the top of our agenda. We start the meetings with, a hello and a welcome, and then we jump into the equity checklist. And that was important, I think, in two really specific ways. One was, again, it is about just operationalizing the asking of the questions. We did not have solutions every time. We sometimes didn't have responses to the questions. But the practice of pausing, taking the time to reflect as a team was really important. And the other thing that I think we agreed was really critical was that oftentimes, and we found this early in the process, we would have the equity audit on the agenda for our weekly meetings, but there is so much to do. We had a lot going on. There's always quite a bit of work. And the equity audit for some time was at the end of the agenda. And as many of us know, things at the end of the agenda can often get bumped off and not covered. And so moving it to the start of the meeting made sure that it was not overlooked inadvertently, but also had time dedicated as appropriate. If we go to the next slide, another tool that we wanted to highlight for the team was one of the rubrics that we created. Again, this was in the development and planning for the AZL awardee meeting. And this was an opportunity that we found to really take some of the racial equity concepts or terms that were outlined in the Awake to Woke to Work framework and really be intentional and specific as a team about identifying what that particular concept or term might look like, right? So there's a beautiful glossary in the back of the framework that has terms like dominant culture, white supremacy culture, microaggressions, things like that. And one of the things that we talked about in those early conversations that Cecilia mentioned were, what do these terms mean? Do we agree on the definition? But then what does it look like, right? We might see a really nice definition of dominant culture, but what does that actually look like? How might it show up in some of the areas of our work? And so together we built out these rubrics where we individually and together mapped out responses to the questions of how might this term show up at the awardee meeting? What goals do we have for equity in this space? And then what specific practical steps might we take to support progress and success in that particular area? I won't go through all of this, and please know we're happy to share the slides. But as an example, for this example on this slide, which is dominant culture, we talked about, for example, that the meeting style and format of a traditional awardee meeting that's hosted by NSF has a style and a format that is typically modeled after academic conferences, and recognizing that that dominant culture of academia is not as inclusive or equitable as we might want it to be. And so then our goals for equity in that area were that multiple cultures will pervade the ethos and vibe of the meeting, right? That we really want to shift beyond just academic culture, but think about how to incorporate the culture of our partner organizations, the individuals who are served by the portfolio, et cetera, would be integrated into the meeting. And one of the ways that we would want to attend to that would be really focusing on who's invited to help inform and plan, as well as implement various aspects of the meetings. And so you'll see that we went from a kind of a core term into some really tactical steps that we ended up using during the planning process for the meeting and referring back to throughout those stages of preparation and implementation. If we go to the next slide, the last thing that we want to share is in terms of a tool is to go back to what Cecilia shared was about the pulse check report. So the pulse check tool, I should say, which was in beta form when we used it, is offered by the Equity in the Center as a tool for assessing an organization. It is a digital-based survey tool designed to be done by an organization, so by a team. And so the case team, both the co-PIs as well as staff, spent almost 3 hours on Zoom together responding to the questions in the survey. And the output of that survey is an overall report that shares the organizational score for the institution based on our responses. And so you'll see here at the top, the overall score that was assigned to CASE was that we were woke. So in that middle position, but in the low range of woke. So not closer to perhaps the awake side than the work side. And one of the things that was interesting about that finding was that during the discussion, which was really rich, and we recorded the conversation, which ended up being really valuable, as we were working together to take that survey and respond to the questions, we wrestled with some of our answers and coming to consensus. We all had different perspectives on CASE. We had come to CASE at different times and with different roles. But ultimately at the end, where we landed was struggling to decide whether CASE was in the awake phase or in the woke phase. We all thought we were kind of in the middle, and the report actually did end up coming back with a score that was consistent with that, which was nice to see. The other thing that the report provides that's really useful is a score on each of those levers that we showed earlier. So in each of the different areas of the organization, our responses generated a score that we then, were connected to a set of recommendations. So in order to move the needle forward on the scale, there were specific recommendations on how to engage community, ways to use data in different ways, practices around hiring and maintaining staff, et cetera. So as a resource for an organization that is moving into doing continued work, it ended up being, I think, a really nice tool. And as we know, CASE has sunset and won't be moving forward as an organization, but for an organization that is doing that work, I think this was a really nice tool to integrate into the practice. So the last thing we will share before we open up for questions is just a very quick summary of what we have learned. So if we go 2 slides ahead, Jamie, I'll turn it back to Cecilia to kick us off for our first 2 key learnings.
And we really had lots of insights. So these are 4 that we thought might be most useful to share. The first is, and maybe it's not a surprise, but just how much time and dedicated focus this work took. This was, as Jamie said at the beginning, certainly supported in terms of NSF backing us on doing this work. We certainly had resources for it, and yet it felt like we could have used an extra 6 months, maybe longer, just because of the amount of work it took, both in terms of really mapping this out. And then one of the things we realized is that there's a way in which, as you move into the process, it opens up a set of questions or a set of insights that almost it's going like down a rabbit hole, right? Then you realize, oh, we must also think about this. That requires us to build this other piece. And so in a way, also, even the tools that were shared, those were somewhat iterative as well. And then we realized, wow, that thing we just developed, we can use it for these 3 things we're doing, or so forth. And so there was just a lot of considerable work in that process. And it certainly helped that we had that we were resourced for it, but I think just time constraints in terms of everything else that we had going on, I think was a real challenge. The other piece was the importance of having this be a team effort and also building that cohesion early on. So this idea of it's really about coming together and having a shared vision, understanding and grounding the team in what those goals are, what even we're doing, right? Like, so some of that terminology that we talked about was really important. There was a certain amount of trust building that we were doing. And this was a team, as a team, we've done quite a bit of work together. So we knew each other well, which I think helped. But, some of these conversations weren't always easy. And so being able to have the level of trust to be able to do that and even call each other out. So as we went through those, for example, 7 questions, it was both holding ourselves accountable, but being able to be comfortable calling it out for the group and the team being able to be receptive to that. So just also in terms of work distribution, that was really critical. And to be fair, I think one of the things we found that despite our efforts, the the work often did fall on team members who identified as BIPOC. So that was something that was we experienced quite a bit of tension around, and we were trying to be attentive to, but I don't know that we always reached that. And Rabia, do you want to talk about the next two?
Yeah, sure. So quickly, because I'm noting time, sorry about that, but is that the external advisors, and I don't need to say much more than what Cecilia shared, they were incredibly important in providing feedback on the process. We really had a fantastic committee. We genuinely enjoyed the conversations that we had with them. They were very generous with their time and their insights. And it was really important both to provide the feedback, but also there was an additional layer of accountability. And so we went to them with our observation tools and rubrics. We asked for their input on how the awarding meeting was being planned. And they also, as part of the historical document review, gave some really important insights on their experience with CASE as members of the broader informal science learning community that complemented what was captured in the documents. So it was really fantastic to have the committee. We also had other individuals who supported the awardee meeting in facilitating what we called critical conversations, but also in observing sessions and providing feedback as well. So again, that extended network of people who had some connection with CASE and providing input was really important. And then the last, and you've heard us talk about this quite a bit today, is that having direct and actionable tools were really critical for integrating equity plans into practice. We certainly could have taken the approach of conducting the audit and asking questions and analyzing our data and saying, okay, at the end of the year, let's figure out what we will actually start doing. And I think we agree that would have been a really missed opportunity. So the ability to pause, to develop the rubrics and the tools, as imperfect and emerging and iterative as they were, was very important for operationalizing habits and practice, and to learn in real time how we could get comfortable, how we could wrestle with some of those difficult conversations and be reflective and move the needle in some important ways in real time that were, I think, visible in quite a bit of our work. I think the checklists and the tools that we use were very context specific, right? And I think really in many cases that needs to be true, with the exception of, say, the first two questions, right? Are we defaulting to who we know? Are we defaulting to what we do? Those are really broad, I think context agnostic. But if you go down our list, you'll see there's some specificity around awardee meeting, for example, because we started using it for the awardee meeting. But as Cecilia mentioned, we then transitioned it to be more general. And so we made some adjustment. So my sense would be that the process that we undertook to develop the checklist was actually really important and is not captured in the checklist itself, right? When we share it, and that we might encourage people to think about how they could have conversations to identify what are the questions that we need to be asking that might be very specific to the work we're doing, where we are, et cetera. Because I will say, and I don't speak for the team, the development of the tools themselves was a really enriching process, both in learning about each other and our positions and the questions that we had. It was a place where we could challenge each other, like, oh, is that too safe, right? Is that actually not really the right question? And I don't think we would want other teams to miss out on that particular opportunity. So maybe it's a both and, maybe it's a reference point, but not an adopt wholesale, might be a recommendation we could consider. I don't know, Cecilia or Jamie, if you've got.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That I totally agree with that. And one of the things that, for example, that 7-question piece was the 7 questions was something that Rabia and I led the development of, and it came out of some of the planning meetings that we were leading. But then the columns that you see after that, we intentionally left those blank, so that the work of how we then operationalize that, both the definition and what would this look like, was something that happened as a team, because that team process was so important for a lot of reasons, on some very pragmatic ways, buy-in, but also because really it has to be a team effort in order for us to be able to have a tool that we're both familiar with and that we'll use. So you're making me think maybe it's sharing a little bit of a template with the caveats that you could use this as a starter, but there's probably a lot more work that you would want to do within your context.
one of the benefits of Case being a small team was that like the team was the team, right? There are the 4 co-PIs and Jamie, and then a relatively small staff. So in total, we were about what, 8, Jamie? 8 or 9 or so. And that was, I think, really nice. Also, so it's hard to say how that would maybe work for a larger team. I will say that, and then I'll stop talking, is that the fact that the team itself worked so regularly together felt incredibly important, right? It's a team that met every week for years. And so there was a baseline of just comfort and familiarity that it would be hard for me to think that we could have moved as quickly given all challenges of the year if we didn't have that. And so I think that is both professional respect, but also just experience with each other. Because, for example, when we dove into things like, when did you first hear the term white supremacy culture? And I'm really uncomfortable with, what some of these words are. There was a foundation that made that safer than there might, that might have been present in another context. So that felt to me perhaps more important than size, although we did have the luxury, I think, of having a relatively small group. I will say, working at another organization when we're doing equity work, not having that kind of foundational piece has been very challenging, because I think there's a fundamental trust that allows you to move into some of these, sensitive spaces. That's important, if not necessary, to move forward.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that was really the piece that was so important, is that having then this 8-person committee was a really helpful sort of moving out one rung in the circle, because they asked questions that sometimes we hadn't thought about ourselves. And so getting that question helped us look at some of our assumptions, or even our own process maybe had a few blinders. And so there is something about the familiarity and the size of that initial group, but then having some way in which you're able to bring other individuals that are somewhat familiar with your work, or in the area that you're working in, but that can provide some input in that way, felt like an important piece of the team makeup. One of the things we found was that, in a way, given Case's charge, it was really often reflecting where the field at that moment, rather than always leading. And so you could see that, for example, in the work, in that and of course, in retrospect, you're like, oh, right, because that was the charge. But it's interesting then to know how a charge of a resource center can really bound and potentially be in tension with issues where the field maybe needs a little bit more of a push, right? Particularly in this equity space. So, for example, in the historical documents, just looking at language, you could see where we were beginning to use the diversity and inclusion language very early on, and then how we've shifted to broadening participation, and then eventually to other terms. And so you could see that progression. And so that was just fascinating to look at. Another area that we strongly found in the document review is how were committees, how were people who were invited to convenings, to other things, invited, and what was the historical record that showed how criteria were or were not developed. So it was really interesting to think about it from that. Are we defaulting to who we know? And it seeded a lot of really interesting conversations around tensions, right? Were these convenings, for example, meant to be groups of experts? And then, to Rabia's point, who's considered an expert versus would it have been generative, or as generative, to open it up in a different way? So those are the kinds of, I think, questions or insights that we had from the document that then served both to give us kind of an assessment, if you will, and at the same time begin to identify opportunities how you might shift practice.
Briefly, I was mentioning that I think one of the things the committee brought up in particular, just as an example, was acknowledging some of the work that CASE did, I think in some of its task forces and other areas around involving broader broader participation from the field, but they pushed and asked us on a number of occasions, but who was at the table making the decision at the outset, right? At what level was inclusion and diversity and ultimately equity thought about at the executive decision-making level? And so they pushed on that, I think, from the historical perspective, but also pushing us to think about that moving forward.